This event today is presented by the Consulate General of Ireland in Vancouver as part of the 2021 St. Bridget's Day Festival here. And as is our custom here in British Columbia, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional, unceded and ancestral territories of the McWilliams, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh people. I would like to also acknowledge that you are joining us today from many places near and far, and I want to acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands also. Traditionally, St. Bridget's Day has been celebrated in Ireland as the beginning of spring and as a time of renewal. Since 2018, Irish diplomatic missions and Irish communities around the world have organised a series of events to mark this day in celebration of the creativity of Irish women. On February 1st last year, the inaugural St. Bridget's Day Festival Vancouver, we joined 35 other Irish missions and cultural groups around the world in honouring Ireland's matriarchal saint. This year in Vancouver, we have been delighted to welcome guests from around the world for a week-long event featuring a series of remarkable and inspiring women from January 31st to February 7th. So before I introduce our very special guest today, I would like to welcome the Ambassador of Ireland to Canada, Dr. Eamon McKee, to say a few words of welcome. Ambassador, over to you.
Jennifer, great to be here, and hello to all our guests. I want to acknowledge as well Anne Derwin, a colleague of mine who's currently our ambassador in Beijing, because it was actually Anne back in the department in 2017 started planning for St. Bridget's Day, and she said, we really need to do something around this, and it's really come from there. And I think it's great to see this balance in the year, because I mean, we got St. Patrick's Day, very patriarchal, and it's great and all of that, but it's great to see finally St. Bridget kind of as part of what we do. I'm particularly delighted to be part of this as well, because I was 20 years involved in the Northern Ireland peace process. And Monica and I wandered around the corridors of Castle Complex back in 1998. We were kind of locked into the building. To be honest, it was a bit like COVID. We couldn't leave until we got a deal. So we used to wander around, we'd find each other in the corridor and have a natter. And you know, I knew that she and the rest of the Women's Coalition were going around doing the same thing. But before I return to that, maybe it's worthwhile reminding ourselves of what the peace process was about. In very brief terms, you think about this. The peace process begins with the Troubles, effectively in 1969. We have Sunningdale, 1972, 73, 74. We then have parallel talks going on for decades, as well as conflict. We have a ceasefire in 1994. We have a second ceasefire in 1997. We do the deal into 1998, but it's almost another 10 years, 2007, before we have a stable power sharing government. And we have to work at that. And of course, now we have Brexit, which is a black swan event. We just could never have predicted that. But you know, we've had the Good Friday Agreement bring peace and stability to Northern Ireland, and also create an historic breakthrough in Anglo-Irish relations. You know, we've really got very, very close to Britain. We had a historic reconciliation, I think best symbolized by the visit of Queen Elizabeth II in 2011. A lot of good things have flowed from it. But to go back to Castle Complex, April 1998, I remember being in the room with a couple of senior officials, and I was talking about the number of people who contributed to this peace process over the years. And I was very shocked to hear him say, well, actually, no, it's just a few good men in a room. And I was going, no, it's not a few good men in a room scribbling away on text and that and the other. It's actually much more than that. And the injury there was, A, to all of the people who had contributed to the peace process, and all of the people in small ways and large had tried to forge a bridge across the sectarian divide, who had tried to see past the violence and get to some common ground. But the other point was that the Women's Coalition, that their role was actually very important in those talks, because they were one of the few participants who had license to go and talk to absolutely everybody. And then they would share things that they felt needed to be shared, so that everybody who was participating in the Good Friday Agreement talks recognized their thumbprint in it at the end of the day, that there was a part of them here, that nothing was kind of left behind. We really tried to deal with absolutely everything. The problem, I suppose, is that, and this happens with peace processes, women get involved, they make it happen, and then they're forgotten about. They're kind of sidelined. When I was asked to set up the conflict resolution unit, one of the things we did launch was UN Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security, and we're now on our third iteration of that. And Ireland has played a really great role, I think, in advancing this agenda. The agenda, I think, it's always a bit like rolling a rock up the hill, to be honest. You just have to keep at it. And I remember one of the members of the Women's Coalition saying to me, oh, if only we had 1325 back in 1998, how easy it would have been to slot things in on that side of the house. So I think, you know, we've discovered, particularly between financial crisis and COVID and everything else, organizations run by men are dumb and dangerous. We have to have women in positions of power and influence. And I'm really delighted to be part of this session here, where we talk about an avatar for powerful women in Bridget, and we're going to meet a powerful woman in Monica. So with that, I'll hand you over and wish you best of luck with this session. Thanks very much, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for that. Very much appreciated, and delighted especially to have somebody who is themselves involved in the Northern Ireland peace negotiations as well as our special guest today. So without further ado, it is my very great honour and privilege to introduce our very special guest speaker today, academic, peace activist and former politician Monica McWilliams. As you'll know from watching the documentary film Wave Goodbye to Dinosaurs, which was part of this event, and you should have all received your link, Monica McWilliams represented the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition at the multi-party peace negotiations and is herself a signatory to the Good Friday Peace Agreement. She was elected to the Northern Ireland Legislative Assembly and subsequently appointed as Chief Commissioner of the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, where she drafted the advice on a Bill of Rights. Monica is currently a member of the Independent Reporting Commission for the Disbandment of Paramilitary Organisations and is the chairperson of Interpeace, an international NGO. She is a recipient of the John F. Kennedy Profile and Courage Award and is currently writing a memoir that will be published in 2021. Monica, thank you so much for being here with us today. It's an absolute pleasure. And I'm going to start off by asking you, how are you? How are you doing? And how has the last year been for you during this pandemic?
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and thank you to Ambassador Amy McKee as well for those kind words. And I'm delighted to be here tonight. I think it's morning with you to celebrate St. Bridget, who's one of my kind of people that I look up to in terms of her laying the foundation for us. It's been an unusual year, a strange year. In many ways, I feel that I've connected more with family because we can't meet up as much. But in another way, I've been distanced because my son lives in Chicago. So I've missed out on his engagement and he's had to cancel his wedding. He was to come home to Ireland, not once, but twice, but 3 times. But I've survived and I've thrived in some ways too. I'm a cancer survivor. So I had to be super careful, but I got my vaccination yesterday and I never thought I'd be dancing down the street, celebrating getting a prick in my arm and looking forward to the second. And I'm also looking forward to hearing the words again. This is your captain speaking. Because as someone who's traveled to probably about 130 countries now, mostly in conflict, if not all, I find it very strange to be grounded for as long as I have been. But it gave me the opportunity to write the book and I finished it on Sunday night.
Congratulations.
So I'm very pleased about that. So I used the time productively.
Wonderful. I'm glad to hear that. I'm delighted you got your vaccine. I think a lot of people are feeling those pressures and strains and that kind of dichotomy between being closer to people but also further away. It's a hard time on a lot of different levels. And the travel as well. The travel is a big thing for people like yourself. And I think we'll come back to that a little bit later when we talk about some of the work that you've done around the world with women in conflict. So let's get stuck straight in. And just for our audience, for our viewers, please feel free to ask your questions. Pop them in the Q&A box as we go along throughout the event. I'm going to be asking Monica questions back and forth, but I'll also be keeping an eye on the Q&A, and whatever questions you have, I'll try and get them in there as well. So first off, Monica, we hear in the documentary film, Wave Goodbye to Dinosaurs, We hear Brona Hines and Bernadette Evelyn talking about their role models as being, some of their role models being African-American women who fought for their civil rights in the USA. Who were your role models growing up? And not just growing up, but as you went through life as an academic, as a peace activist and a politician, and even now, who are the women who have stood out to you?
They came from near and far, and the same civil rights leaders that inspired Brona and Bernadette also inspired me. We were learning about Rosa Parks giving up her seat. So it wasn't just Martin Luther King, it was this very brave, ordinary woman who was doing an extraordinary act and refusing to sit down or shut up and move to the back. In fact, it reminds me of my own days going on the bus to school, where, sad to say, the Protestants sat at the front and the Catholics sat at the back for 7 solid years. And so it wasn't just girls and boys that were separated, we were separated by religion. And for some reason, that was the norm. It wasn't that we were told, it was just those were our seats and we accepted it. So I went into civil rights and was involved in the marches. But I guess the person next to have a huge impression on me was in Detroit. I won a scholarship to study at the University of Michigan in urban planning. And he had an all-Black student class. He was an African-American professor. And I went into inner city Detroit with him to a group called the Grassroots Organization of Workers. And he taught me to listen to them and to take my direction from them in terms of planning. And I saw, sad to say, an Irish descendant, probably grandson perhaps, little red-haired, freckled-faced cop, tell me to get out of the road and asked me what was I doing down in this Black area neighborhood. And who was that? And he used the word, capital N, in reference to my professor. It had a huge impact on me. And I was also taking slides. I was doing my thesis on comparing inner city Belfast to inner city Detroit. Can you imagine?
Wow.
And there was a lot of commonality at that time in the mid-70s. So that had a huge influence. And my parents had a huge influence. I mean, we had neighbors who were getting picked up and interned. And a young cousin interned and then the same day released because the army didn't know who was who. And so we were quite frightened. But my mother was very insistent that we didn't use hate speech, that we didn't get involved ourselves in violence. My father took us on the civil rights marches. And although we were getting CS gas fired at us and rubber bullets, they were very insistent that we didn't, civil disobedience, yes. And the family withheld the rates as an act against internment. So that had an impression on me that I did not want to become involved in any kind of repressive way. And it also left a mark to show, like the women in the Arab Spring and all around the world now, that we set out with nonviolent civil disobedience and had huge repressive actions against us. But I still genuinely believe that civil disobedience, as we see in Myanmar now, it does connect, and we raised it internationally. The peace activism and politicians, I was fortunate to meet David Irvine. I was a young Catholic Irish woman reared on a farm. He was a working class Belfast loyalist Protestant man, born in the shadow of the shipyards. 2 completely different backgrounds. And at his funeral, his wife asked me to speak, and I said we were like brother and sister. And I said it wasn't a gun attack. It could have been that killed him, because he was such a leader. He was leading his own side and challenging his own people. And he often, while wearing a bulletproof vest, expected them to shoot him first. But the pressure took a toll, and at 52, he was gone. And a very sad loss. I feel it to this day. But that's the kind of friendship that we were able to develop through the peace process and through the peace negotiations. And his mark as a politician, as a leader, as a peace activist who had been a combatant and was imprisoned for 8 years, it showed me that people can change. We all change. I changed. You don't come through conflict and it doesn't have, leave a mark on you and change you. And I ask now, am I a better person as a result? Because, you can be taught intellectually at university, and I am a university professor. And so the intellect comes from the mind. But I guess the wisdom comes from the heart. the compassion. And so all of those people were wonderful role models.
Great, thank you so much for sharing. It strikes me as well when you talk about your parents, how I think in the film Anne Carr says an amazing line that I think sums up a lot. She says, peace is different people choosing to live differently. Yeah. I think that's the line. I'm sorry if I'm misquoting her, but that's what strikes me about your parents' behavior in the face of such hostility and such violence, and when those around them would have been reacting in a violent manner, that they chose, I guess, to behave with civil disobedience rather than kind of direct violence, which is incredible. And obviously, as you say, had a great impact on you. So that's great, amazing to hear.
Anne Carr also says, Jennifer, that, and I think it's Anne, but one of us, when we were all sitting in our circles and somebody said that we wanted to be living in a country where no one ever feels the compulsion to pick up a gun in order to get their objective met. Yeah. And that was also something that I felt. I'm the mother of 2 sons. I also spent 40 years working on domestic violence and sexual violence and all of those kind of weapons, and making the connection between war and peace. And it isn't just the guns that kill, it's all of those other things and attitudes. Hate speech leads to it. As David Irvine would have said, there were people that sent him out who'd polished the bullets but didn't fire them. And so I think that's really the connection that you're making, is it's choosing to live differently.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some people can choose that more easily than others. But any way you look at it, yeah, that choice is the key, one of the key things. I think I'll move on now to a question that I think a lot of people will be really interested in, and it was something we spoke about before we came on with the ambassador as well. So the way that yourself and Pearl and the other women of the Women's Coalition were spoken to and treated by the men involved in the peace process, and not to mention the abuse and threats received from people in the public as well when you were campaigning. It's really shocking. It's really shocking for us to hear and to watch that in the documentary. Had you expected that level of hostility? And do you think you were prepared for it, prepared for that treatment when you sat down at the negotiating table?
I wasn't. And I kept asking myself, have I wronged these men in another life?
Yeah.
You know, why are they doing this? And then you start asking yourself, what have I done? So you have to get that out of your head, because they've got inside your head to think it's something you've done. They enjoyed it. They were bonding together. They were having a good time. And we were the ones getting humiliated. I had to show that I wasn't angry, because they were expecting to wind us up and make us angry. And so we used good humor. When they told us they'd teach us to stand by our men, we sang Stand By Your Man. And, you know, so we humor saved us, but also there were times on Friday nights when I went home and I took off my armor, which was covered in arrows that had been fired all day. And I would stand for a long time in the shower to wash off the misogyny. But I had small children. So they brought me back to reality. And there were fun times. I mean, one of them shouted at me, "Shut up and sit down, you stupid, silly woman." And I was putting my youngest 6-year-old to bed, and it was a beautiful summer night. And he said, "Mum, that's terrible what those men are shouting at you." But he said, "You're a little silly for putting me to bed at 6 o'clock when it's so bright outside." And so reality kicks in as well. You have to leave that outside the door. But, you know, we had to stand up and challenge it. And we had an insult of the week notice board, and it was unanswered. This was an elected forum. It was called the Forum for Dialogue and Understanding. And we renamed it the Forum for Monologue and Misunderstanding, because they did not use their ears in proportion to their mouth. I mean, you've one mouth, 2 ears. They weren't listening. They were in monologues and talking and shouting. And so we stuck the insult up on the notice board and put it outside our office, the date and the person. And they'd come along and be shocked and say, "Heavens, what are you doing?" And we said, "Well, you know, you need to be named and shamed. This is what you're saying." well, can I get you to take it down? I promise I won't do it again. So there were kind of tactics like that, but in the end, the media and the television cameras outed them, and people started voting for us. Because the women in the country were shocked. They said, if we're going to transition from conflict to peace, we've got to transform these attitudes. And that goes with it. And I think for opportunistic reasons, eventually all of the parties got the message. This is not how you treat women. And they then started, especially on the nationalist side and Sinn Féin, started putting more women up the ladder. So we had a kind of contagion effect. I don't want to put an analogy with COVID, but it did have a contagion, and it started to have an impact at our expense, I have to say, at times. But it was so bad, Jennifer, I forgot about it. And when the peace talks were signed, I said, that's it. You know, let's not remember it. But I've had to write my book, and it's a chapter in the book. So every time they said, shut up and sit down, and much worse, I titled the book, Stand Up and Speak Out.
Fantastic, amazing. I just, watching the documentary film and seeing the way that you were spoken to and the other women was just shocking. And to think that was only just over 20 years ago is incredible. And, you know, obviously we're all thrilled that you had the bravery and the guts to go in there and do it, and the commitment to stay there. But yeah, I can imagine it would have been extremely difficult. And what you've spoken there a little bit about your children kind of ties into my next question, was that the all-party talks went on for almost 2 years, which is a long time to be dealing not only with peace negotiations, but to be dealing with hostility. And so during that time, how did you personally deal with that pressure and the work of trying to build strong relationships with people who are hostile to you? I think one of the scenes in the film that really stuck out to me as well, there were lots of them, but one of them was when Pearl talks about having to sit down. So Pearl was married to a British army officer, I think, and had a cousin who was a police officer, and having to sit in a room with Sinn Féin representatives and just feeling completely horrified and overwhelmed. So those kind of situations where there was immense pressure on yourself and Pearl and others, how did you deal with that personally?
Do you know, feminists say the personal is political, and it's true. On the other hand, you know, you could get very emotional, and we couldn't afford to be. We had to be very focused. And of course, they would have expected us to get emotional at times. I mean, the man that was sitting beside me in the peace table from the UDA, my boyfriend was murdered in 1974, and he was in it. Seamus Mallon had a friend, Hattie Wilson, who was stabbed 26 times by the same man who was sitting right beside him. There was hardly a person actually around the table when I did a look around who hadn't been shot at or attacked in some way. So you sit with your enemies, that's the first thing. But so you had to make relationships work. And if people were kind of starting on a road to promise that we weren't going back, you had to believe in that. So that's led us to talk to people that nobody else was talking to. We formed a small group of 4 because we were the 4 smallest parties, which involved the 2 loyalists. Now, remember, we'd been around for 25 years. I think at some stage, as Peter Robson says, where did these women come from? Where were they? Well, we'd been there. We'd been in the civil society organizations, the women's movement, Rape Crisis Centre, women's aid shelters. We didn't fall out of the sky. And we didn't ask the women to leave their religion, their faith, their values outside the door. We said, let's work across our differences. Now, I was shocked when I saw the documentary again and saw Pearl say that. Because at the time, all of us were trying to keep her own personal baggage intact. And she says in the film that she couldn't hear a word that Gerry Adams was saying because her heart was thumping so much that it was thumping right into her ears. And, you know, we had to provide safety for the women because they were going home at night into districts where they could get their windows broken or attacked. Actually, in the end, Pearl had to move house. But likewise, you know, we were having stones put through the coalition's windows. And, you know, we didn't have guns. We weren't out attacking anybody. But because of the stance we were taking and in challenging and standing up to the kind of thinking, and there were dinosaurs who were refusing to change. So And we had kids. Fortunately, the talks weren't that far from my own home. So I do marvel at anyone, man or woman, who has to travel a distance many miles away and leave their children behind, which was the case with the Colombians when they went off to Cuba to negotiate for 4 years. But, I had a ROCS. I had my husband who was doing the feeding and nutrition and nourishing, and my sister, who stepped in at a moment's notice, as sisters do. So by nature and by nurture, I managed to get through it. I don't, looking back, you do it. You know what you do? You just do it. Extraordinary times demand extraordinary energy, extraordinary enthusiasm. But at the end of the day, a belief that we cannot go back. I'd lived for 30 years. I dived out of bombs. I saw people being shot dead right beside me. I'd been to graves, unburied people belonging to me and friends. I wasn't going back to that. And if that doesn't drive you, what would?
Wow. Yeah, amazing. And as you say, I guess a lot of one foot in front of the other to have the energy to do that and look after a family, the same as a lot of the women in there. Another question I wanted to put to you was another thing that stood out from the film, and a very exasperating incident, I'm sure people who've seen it will agree, was when the parties were invited to the White House and everybody had a meeting with Bill Clinton, but you and Pearl were forgotten about. And then we see that a meeting is quickly arranged with Hillary Clinton, who subsequently very publicly notes that the important work that the Women's Coalition have done. And in the film, it's mentioned that this moment changed everything. How did you feel about that whole incident? And can you talk a little bit about how things did change, like what came afterwards?
Well, first, it was our first time to go into the White House. I think I've been there more times than I've had dinner since. But we were kind of pinching ourselves, Pearl and I. And we weren't that gutted that we weren't meeting the president because there was going to be a meeting that night of all the parties in a lineup. And we had heard the other parties over and over to the point of boredom in terms of the same message being said. So when somebody said, Hillary Clinton would like to meet you as an alternative, we bounced at it. And it was Mo Mowlam who was around, the wonderful British Secretary of State. And she said, Gerd, you've got 10 minutes. And we were still there after an hour and a half. Mo had gone and we sat down. And if you remember, Hillary Clinton was going through her own hard time with the kind of lawyers' investigation that was going on. And it was a pretty nasty time of American politics. Didn't help my name was Monica at a later stage either. But we had a really good conversation about how she was feeling the brunt of it. Can you imagine the First Lady and ourselves comparing notes on what it was like to be a woman? And I said to her, look, Hillary, what you have to do is remind yourself every day this is more about them than it is about you. And then I caught myself on and thought, I've just given the First Lady some advice rather than the other way around. And then she said, what can I do for you? And I said, well, you're speaking tonight at the event. And it would be good if you could raise the issue of the inclusion of women and the importance of having women at the table and around the table. And she said, certainly. She got up and she said to the men in the room, there was silence. I met a group of women this afternoon at the Women's Coalition, and that definitely brought silence. And because, they wouldn't have batted an eyelid at our name before. And so they stood and listened. And she said, I want you to pay attention to them. And I want you to know that the women in the south and the north of Ireland, on the island of Ireland, who are going to make the difference in peace building. And there was again silence because not everybody in the room would have paid much attention to the south of Ireland. But it was St. Patrick's Day. And of course the Irish Taoiseach was there. It was actually, well, it would have been John Bruton the first year, and then it was Bertie Ahern after that. And it really, so South and North were coming together in that White House. And suddenly there was a little space opened for women. Well, the men kind of changed their attitude a bit after that. Not completely, but they sided up to me and said, how much did you pay her to say that? And I said, I don't have to do those kinds of things. I said, we didn't even know, and I actually didn't even know that she was going to do it because she hadn't said it. And then when we lined up to meet Bill that night, he whispered in my ear, I believe my wife had a much more interesting time this afternoon than I had. And of course, those being good diplomats, we never said a word to anybody. But when we came out of the meeting, the next day we opened the Washington Post, and she had written an article about the meeting. And she then established an organization called Vital Voices, which was to connect women in conflict in different parts of the world with each other. And those women from the Middle East started coming to Belfast. And we started meeting up with Milan Verveer. And to this day, Milan Verveer, her chief of staff, who was in that meeting, and I are best friends. So that's 25 years later. And there's not a day or a week goes by that we don't email each other. She later became the global ambassador under President Obama, the global ambassador for women's affairs. And so we used to meet up in conflict areas. We used to laugh and say, oh, well, if there's a war going on, we'll see you there. Because she was such a dedicated person. And Hilary stayed involved. When I got cancer, she was kind enough to write me a letter, which was really consoling because, you know, I was very sick. When I burst my appendix, coming to the States on an aircraft, just getting off the plane, and I never got to where I was meant to give her an award. I ended up at George Washington Hospital getting my appendix out. She came and rang me and rang the hospital. And I was at Punter in the hospital, and suddenly the First Lady was on the phone looking for the patient. So it's that kind of friendship. It's those kind of moments of reaching out that meant more to all of us than, and so my message to women is get a champion. And as I was writing the book last night, I came across a letter. I'd been in Myanmar, way up on the Chinese border in horrendous conditions with a group of women, a bit like the Rohingyas, who were suffering ethnic cleansing. And these are the Christians who live in Kachin, Baptists and Catholics who are persecuted and by the army, much of what's going on at the minute in the junta. And I got them to write a letter as part of their negotiations, teaching negotiation skills. And I said, tell Hillary Clinton what your 6 main points are. So they sat down and wrote the letter. And the next time I was in Washington, I gave it to Milan Verveer and said, would you pass that to Hillary from this group? I didn't know that she'd written back. She actually wrote back. I found the letter yesterday because I got in touch with Trócaire, the Irish Aid Organisation. And I said to them, can you just remind me of the itinerary? And they said, oh, by the way, Hillary Clinton wrote back. That was 4 years ago. And I had, you know, I'd left Kachin and the women, they were able to tell me the women were absolutely delighted that they'd found a champion. I think champions are important. I've met women in the world who said they would have been shot dead when they were arrested and detained in prison had they not had a photograph of Hillary Clinton standing beside them. So that kind of shows you the safety that's needed in some countries for champions. So that's kind of the message, that it's really important when you're isolated, that you are small, that you don't think anybody's listening. Yes, the international community, and this is where the Department of Foreign Affairs and the ambassadors really helped us, because the international community raises that voice to a platform that you never dreamed that you would get onto. And so when I go to countries now to do the workshops, that's what I'm trying to tell them, is build your network of influence and build it through other women who've been there before and exchange the stories and build on what they've been able to show and find these people who really are passionate about making a difference in women's lives, particularly in conflict areas.
Like yourself. People like yourself, Monica. And actually that ties in with a question that I had a bit further on, which is, does the Northern Ireland peace process in general and the story of the Women's Coalition in particular still provide useful lessons for peace process elsewhere in the world? And I think the simple answer is yes, but what have you found through your work with other people in the world that the most useful lessons are for other peace processes?
Well, there's different stages. to the process. First, there's kind of talks about talks, and women have to be involved at every stage. Then there's the actual talks itself, where you make promises, and they're only promises on paper. And the Good Friday Agreement was a very good paper, but it was still promises. So the third stage, where you actually implement, is the most important and the hardest. And I've been at it for the last 22 years since I signed the agreement on Good Friday. And I've learned an awful lot, which is that, yes, have your aspirations, but if you don't turn those into proposals that have benchmarks and timetables, and sometimes a guarantee, like our Bill of Rights should have been a constitutional guarantee. Instead, it was, left hanging as a kind of aspiration. And now with Brexit, everyone's asking themselves, what happened to the Bill of Rights? So that's a big lesson. Trust, how to build trust. You don't arrive at it. So you need patience, you need persistence, but you have to believe that you can get the seeds of trust. And that's through talking and dialogue and building human relationships, finding the chemistry. It is about personalities, about finding those leaders. And it's talking to people that nobody else wants to talk to, who either because they think they're of no relevance or they're not significant enough, or because they're downright opponents. And I couldn't believe it at our negotiations. There were people got up from the table and they hadn't said good morning to each other. So how are you going to implement a Good Friday Agreement if you haven't even spoken? So there are lots of lessons, but I guess the most important I've learned, because I was at the table, and that was fantastic, and it was a comprehensive agreement, and it was an inclusive process. So process and substance are very important, but delivering on what you promise is a real trust builder. And so other countries I've gone to, including Colombia, they've got an agreement, they've got one of the best constitutions, but it's not being enforced, it's not being enshrined. So you have a real kind of frozen watchfulness about, will we go back? Will there be a reoccurrence? And sometimes you're asked to do things, look, I've had to compromise and didn't like it, but in the end, it's a strength. Yeah, everybody has to give something. And sometimes I had to stick 2 fingers down my throat and avoid throwing up because of what I was having to do. But, that's how peace agreements are also made, but they shouldn't just be made by warlords and warriors. They have to be made by women as well, who haven't acted in those roles. And that's not to say women haven't been combatants, because they have in our situation and others. But the women who bring sustainable peace, Jennifer, who put integrated education on the table? We did. Who put shared housing on the table to break down the segregated communities? We did. Who put a civic forum, a bit like Ireland's Citizens' Assembly, on the table into the agreement? We did. Who wrote the right of women to full and equal political participation? We did. So after the agreement was over, we were very proud of ourselves in that we'd managed to get it in. And there were times when the British officials and the Irish officials, who are people we know and Eamon will know, who said to us, what's this got to do with the particular circumstances of Northern Ireland? It's all about Protestants and Catholics and British and Irish. And we said, no, it's also about, we all lived under an armed patriarchy, and maybe even an ecumenical patriarchy. And we have to change that if we're going to build peace. So we need the right of women to be in public life and public decision making, which is there in the agreement. So it's really about sculpting and crafting and figuring out where you can get these pieces in that make sense to the other negotiators, who really in the end, some of them got so tired, they just said, let the women have it. And so some of it got in because they were worn down.
Yeah, if it works, it works. The when you're talking there about kind of women's involvement, I want to just ask you a quick question. I am aware of time, and I see we've got quite a few questions in Q&A. So I'll ask this, and then we'll go to the participant Q&A. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about Security Council Resolution 1325. So for anybody who's watching who doesn't understand what it is, I'll give you a very quick couple of sentences. So the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 was adopted unanimously in October in the year 2000. It addresses 2 critical issues: the inordinate impact of violent conflict and war on women and girls, as well as the crucial role that women should and already do play in conflict prevention and peace building. That is very narrowed down. It's much broader and wider than that, but they're the general gist, just for anybody who's watching who doesn't understand or know what it is. So my question, I suppose, is 20 years after the adoption of the resolution, how much progress do you really think that the women, peace and security agenda has made from your experience?
Well, first I should say that, remember, the year 2000 was 2 years after the Good Friday Agreement. I had no idea that it was the Women's Coalition's example, that the women negotiating UN 1325 brought us into the table when they were negotiating it. They hadn't actually told us. They told us afterwards. And so I'm very proud of that, because there was only Guatemala and South Africa at that time who had influenced women's, input into the table. So I'm proud that we were part of that. So when 2000 came in, it was very important, not so much in the global north as it is in the global south. As I saw, the women in Africa and Colombia and different regions were using it to get into their negotiations, either parallel or with a gender subcommittee, and they did. Now, again, it's like the agreement, it's only as good as its enforcement. Sad to say, it doesn't apply in Northern Ireland because the UK doesn't believe that there was ever a war in Northern Ireland. And so it's not a designated application under their UK action plan, but it is under Ireland's, which is a significant difference, because Ireland's national action plan, because all countries are expected to produce an action plan to show what actions they're taking, both home and abroad. And I'm very proud that Ireland has done that. It's now in its third, and Ireland has a seat this year, next 2 years, at the Security Council on building peace, preventing conflict and accountability. 3 key pieces of the UN 1325. And one of the most important pieces of that is prevention. I mean, most people think about the protection of women under those resolutions, using human rights, using that women, peace and security to ensure that women get out of prison, that they're not detained, they're not tortured, they're not killed, or even get to the table. But for me, it's also about prevention. How do you stop a conflict? Well, women are the early warning systems. They have the peace huts, they have the circles, they have been talking and chatting across the lines. So the prevention of conflict is where women are very effective. And people forget that. So that's why you get a concentration on soldiers and military and peacekeepers at the UN level. But you actually have to think about the prevention strategies. And that's where the women, peace and security is also very important. Now I've spent, 22, 21 years implementing it, trying to implement it. But it's under that most of the work I'm doing has actually taken place. So I'm glad it's there. We've built on it. There are more resolutions, but it's an unfinished business.
Absolutely.
And building goes on and on and on. And that's where, I think it's really important that Ireland now has this fabulous opportunity with the Security Council seat. I'm very proud of Ireland. I'm sorry that Canada was the loser in that competition, but Canada the next time, I hope. But certainly Ireland deserved to be there, because I saw the work it did. I was a witness to it. And I've witnessed it in far off places, the Lord's Resistance Army up in Northern Gulu, where I went with Ambassador Kevin Kelly, who's now your ambassador in Netherlands. And we spent days and days and days under mosquito nets, lying on the floor in mattresses, so that we could hear and take testimony from the women who had been kidnapped and abducted. And whilst I was there, actually, on an intermittent electricity, because it kept cutting out because they don't have a good electricity, Hillary Clinton came over the radio. She had just announced one of the UN resolutions, the one that she was responsible for putting on when she was Secretary of State, which was amazing. I'm lying up on a mattress and under a mosquito net in Northern Gulu, and suddenly this little radio starts crackling, and the announcement is that another resolution has been passed today. And it was the very one that I was there working on, which was the sexual violence against the women, the massive rapes by the Lord's Resistance Army, the abduction of the women, the forced pregnancies, the women returning with children that weren't accepted by the community, those kinds of issues. And so they were really important, but just those connections, from the local to the global.
Thank you so much. And thanks for mentioning Ireland's seat at the Security Council. I have a question there, but you've actually answered it which is kind of what do you think Ireland should focus on as a member of the Security Council working on the WPS agenda. Prevention tied in with the work that you've been doing is incredibly important. I'm going to go to some Q&A now that have been submitted. The time just flies. I mean, when you're talking to somebody so interesting and with so much experience and so many great things to say, the time just is gone. I think we could be here for hours. So there's a question here from Catherine saying, given the fracture in our society based on haves and have-nots, how do we bring these groups together for a more inclusive society? And how do we have this dialogue online during the pandemic? I know that's a big question, but do you have any thoughts on that?
Actually, there has been lots online in a way that I have never expected. And I've had to learn lots of techie things that I've never done. I mean, I recall Angela Davis, the American civil rights activist. I brought her to Belfast probably in the early 80s. Outstanding character, big afro. I can still remember her coming into little women's groups and talking. She started predicting this stuff. She said, you know, we don't have to all spend weeks organizing a protest. You'll have these little mobiles and you'll have these little apps and people will be able to communicate with each other. And the trade unionists that were in the meeting all looked at each other as if she was mad. And boy, was she prophetic. And the same now, you're able to organize things that I couldn't have organized. We had to send faxes. We had to pick up the old landlines. We had to travel all the time to meetings that took up hours and hours and hours to get there. And now look at how we can use this, which is fantastic. So I'm connected into the most remotest place in the DRC at the minute with the internet. I'm actually doing more meetings at the minute as a result because I don't have to spend days in a plane. And so when someone asks, what can we do? You can always do something. So either it's your nearest group here in British Columbia that is working on the Rohingyas, is working on some group and you've got an interest. Climate change, look at the way our young people have been able to get involved in that in terms of the environment. So I spent a lot of time at small meetings, especially now with the paramilitary organizations, as well as at big meetings like we did the one yesterday where there were 500 involved in Ireland's network on the UN Security Council. And so again, I sat here in our house in Port Stewart up in the North Antrim coast and talked to 500 as we're doing at the minute. So, you know, to find out what your interest is, do it because you have a passion in it. It could be the Middle East, it could be the Palestinian, Israeli situation. It can be a conflict or a humanitarian work. I mean, it blew me away yesterday to hear Ambassador Hyland, the Irish ambassador in charge of political affairs in Dublin, explain to me how they're using the seat to keep the border open in northern Turkey with Syria so that humanitarian aid can cross over. Because Russia wants everything to come through Damascus. And yet the opposition wouldn't be getting that humanitarian aid if it came through Damascus. And Ireland, little Ireland, is managing to keep a border crossing open for the Syrians to be fed and to survive the winter. I am so proud of that. And I'm proud of it because I'm working with Syrian women every day now. They're in Geneva, some of them at the negotiations. But I go to southern Turkey to a place called Gaziantep on the Syrian border. And you have no idea how important that one little act is to those refugees and diaspora and Syrians who are scattered everywhere, and also the ones who are in those little peace circles, as they call them, inside Syria at the minute with their heads down trying to stay alive. So it's actions like that. And also, I only find out things when I'm talking to women. They're stateless. They're widowed. Their husbands have been murdered. They have no passports. So how can we assist them in being able to get out of the country, to get a passport? Those are things that only happen to women. How do we get the women out of detention when their honor is being attacked because they've been in an all-male prison? Do we keep quiet about it and silent and don't tell anybody? Or do we try to get them out under a pseudonym? These are the things I'm learning. And so I try to figure out who can I put them in contact with, who can help. And there was a woman who came with me, and she's now making a film, an Irish woman, following up the Dinosaurs film, a different director. She has devoted the last 5 years of her life to helping the Syrian women. And she does it from County Cavan. And she chairs the Civil Society for Democracy in Syria from County Cavan.
Incredible, incredible. I mean, there's so much work still to be done, and a lot of it is so complex. And I think having women involved and talking to women and doing the work that you're doing and so many people are doing around the world, and also what Ireland has been doing to push the women, peace and security agenda forward, it's also important. And again, from the film, I think, I can't remember who it was who said the phrase, but it stuck out in my mind, which was a tapestry of activism is what it takes to solve problems or to push them forward. I'm going to read a couple of comments. There's one comment here from someone called Anne McGrath, and Anne says, delighted to see Monica again. We met at an Irish American Democrats event during Barack Obama's nomination convention in 2008 and shared a glass of Bertie Ahern. I've been an admirer of Monica and all the strong women who persevered under difficult conditions and played such a major and often unacknowledged role. My cousin Margaret Tynan in Kilkenny, the former Lord Mayor, spoke to me about Monica and her amazing work, and I look forward to reading Monica's book. So that's one comment there. Kathy Murphy, I know Kathy in Toronto. I kept shaking my head as I watched the film and saying, but this is the 90s. We'd already had Margaret and Indira, and for a brief moment in Canada, Miss Campbell. So did you ever look abroad in wonderment, not that other women had an easy time, but that they were in office?
That they were what?
That they were in office, at women in other countries who had achieved political office and political appointments at a time when you were struggling to, you know, even get a seat at the table.
Yeah, I did hear most of it. I'm thinking if it was Margaret Thatcher that you referred to.
I'm not sure. She's saying Margaret and Indira, so I guess so. Like women.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I have to say is, yeah, I don't believe in this theory that all women are the same. I mean, we've got 3 women leaders of parties in Northern Ireland at the minute. So don't put an expectation on women that you don't put on men. You know, I've never met a group of trade unionists who thought the same way, or a bunch of business people who thought the same way. We're not a homogeneous group, and it's our heterogeneity that's our beauty, hence the tapestry. So you work across that diversity, and Margaret Thatcher was not my friend. We used to call her Thatcher the milk snatcher, because she took our wee bottles of milk off us at school, which was meant to be putting a bit of flesh in our wee bones. And she just suddenly wiped off our free milk. So it's about women who are progressive, who want to pass the baton on to others, who don't have egos, who are not narcissistic, who are there because they know how to work in a collective fashion for the better of others, and they want to leave something better behind. Those are the kinds of women. And yes, there were those women, and I met them, who were leaders. And you know, they were fantastic, and they did do what they were supposed to do. And then I've met the opposite. And yet, every time I talk to my male politician colleagues, they say 2 things. Oh, you women are taking over the world, as if. And the second thing they say is, oh, and then they name the worst possible woman who has been just terrible, as if. And so they're not really interested in promoting what we're saying. Those men need to engage with us. They need to be our collaborators. They need to cooperate. We have a hard enough time, you know, working with other women to have non-companions in the male diaspora who only can talk about the examples of women who didn't do good to other women.
Sure. There's another question here that was submitted before this event, actually, and I think it's something that a lot of people will be interested in your thoughts about. So the Women's Coalition was formed for the purpose of social change for all communities in Northern Ireland, regardless of religion or location, and as a way of representing women's voices. Now, nearly 21 years on from the Good Friday Agreement, the political landscape in terms of gender representation has changed, in that we have women leading 3 of the main political parties. With that in mind, do you feel frustrated that the leaders of the 2 main parties are still so focused on the divisive issues of the past in their everyday decision making? And what would you like to see changed or being done differently?
You know, it's a tough one. And you have to remember they have constituents. and they're often talking to their own constituents. And so they're only inching forward in case they go too far. And I think women have a bigger burden from that point of view. And, you know, there's roadkill out there. They'll be taken out very quickly by their own side. So women sometimes are harder on each other to be able to prove that they're as good as any man is. And they have to grow into a different kind of leadership. And yeah, I don't want to do any of them down, but there's a lot of growing to be done. And, you know, sometimes the best leaders are the ones that are not pointing the finger at the other side, but pointing it at their own side and saying, okay, guys, we got to step up here, because we're making the expectations all the time of them. And some people just have scalded memories, Jennifer. And those scalded memories are coming to the fore at the minute, which is horrible, because, you know, I kind of hoped that we'd put some soothing balm on some of them. But with Brexit, it's becoming very toxic. And I got into trouble for suggesting that one of the leaders, Arlene, goes to see Michelle when she broke her leg. And I said, look, you know, sometimes sitting down beside somebody in a hospital bed, away from the cameras, and just finding the humanity in the other person. And I got roasted alive for making such a simple suggestion. But, you know, you do have to find those places where you can talk. And there are not too many neutral places in Northern Ireland still. So there's a lot of work still that's unfinished. But by now, you know, I would have really loved, I'm going to be pushing up the daisies soon. Not too soon.
Not too soon,
but,
don't say that.
yeah, not too soon. But like, you know, I accept that there's, you know, a time when I will be gone, and I want this place that I call home a much safer place and a much better place than the one that I grew up in. And, you know, we never predicted Brexit. We never predicted we would come out of Europe. People ask me about my nationality. I'm Irish, Scots, and European. And with a stroke of a brush, that one part has been removed. And also the shakiness now about British, Irish, or both, which was in the agreement. So there's a lot still to work on, and we need to take that toxic speech away that I'm hearing with the British leaders talking to Irish leaders in a way I had never expected. And when you insult people, you put the goalpost up higher. And I know that the Irish are equally trying desperately not to say too much that puts the goalposts up higher again. But it's unfair. Articles 2 and 3 were removed. That was, you know, for many people, one of those two fingers down your throat moment, where the territory of Northern Ireland was no longer part of the Irish constitution as a right of the island of Ireland. That was a big give. And for people to turn around and say that, you know, the sovereignty of Britain is more important than anything else in the whole world, and that we should, you know, to be coming out of Europe, they hadn't expected these kinds of things to happen. So I'm trying to put some reality back into the situation. Now, what I hear every day and you don't hear are people on saying, but we never thought it would turn out like this. Well, you know, kind of, you're meant to sit down and prepare yourself. You're kind of meant to read through what it means to leave a union. What would happen in Canada? You know, it's a federal country. And, you know, you're Canadians. People there are Canadians and proud of it. I know that it had the Quebecois situation, and we draw, actually. Canadians should know we draw on its social charter. Not right now because of leaving Europe. The social charter of rights, the Charter of Rights, because you've got a parliamentary system in Canada, similar to ours. And so it's a better place for us to make comparisons with than maybe South Africa or other places. And so I use it a lot as an example of how we need to progress.
I find it astonishing, two things. First of all, I find it astonishing that after everything you've done and said, and after how, you know, you're internationally respected, that you would get roasted for making a comment like that about Michelle and Arlene. That's incredible to me. It's just, and then the other thing is about Brexit and foresight. I mean, I'm no Brexit expert. I'll leave that to my amazing colleagues to deal with that. But I think that lack of foresight that you mentioned is a theme that keeps coming back again and again, and is something that's very unfortunate, that the lack of it was there in a lot of ways. I'm really aware of the time. As I say, I wish we could keep going and talk all evening or all afternoon. It's just past 1. So there's one question here that I want to just put to you, and it's about it's from a woman called Jenny, and she says, Monica, thank you for your courageous leadership. Watching the film and hearing you speak tonight reminds us just how far Northern Ireland has come in 22 years. However, we still have far to go. What do you say to people in Northern Ireland today, to politicians, to women, etc.? And I suppose what I would like to hear as well, in light of Brexit and all the complications that that's putting on the table, what words of encouragement and hope do you have for the people of Northern Ireland and for the women of Northern Ireland specifically?
I'm very hopeful. The glass is more than half full. I don't have to go to bed at night and worry if my children are going to come home in safety. Hope and history did rhyme, as Seamus Heaney's beautiful poem. And I witnessed it. I lived long enough to see it. I see trust, I see good relationships. I'm hoping to see our children going to school together from both sides. And I think I will live to see that. I do think that our culture is starting to hopefully be respected. There's multi-languages now, the Irish language and the other languages. We have a rich ethnic minority community now, our new communities. So we're cosmopolitan. And I have to say, Northern Ireland's one of the most beautiful places in the world. So please come. The next time you come back to Ireland, all of you, and into Dublin Airport or Shannon or wherever, just climb on that wee bus and come on up here. And you will find that not only are you in the most beautiful place, but you know, you've got Vancouver Island and you've got beautiful British Columbia. And I've traveled on the Via from Toronto all the way across on the train. And I've stopped in Banff Jasper National Park when I was a student. And I was in awe of the Rockies and raw of, because I'm a farmer's daughter, of the farming that I saw. And just the incredible land. But Ireland is beautiful. It's my home and it's peaceful. And long may that be the case.
Thank you so much, Monica. I'm afraid we do have to wrap it up there, but thank you so much for being with us here today, for sharing your experiences, your knowledge, your stories, your thoughts. Best of luck with I know you've just finished the memoir, and I know it has to go through editing and publication and all of that. I'm sure I speak for everybody here today when I say I can't wait to get my hands on it and have a good read. And thank you for all the work that you've done and continue to do. It's an inspiration, not just for Irish women, but for women all over the world. And I wish you every success.
Well, I'd like to give a shout out for you as well. I'd like people who are listening to understand the role that the Department of Foreign Affairs plays. Incredible role at the Good Friday Agreement. And Eamon McKee, ambassador now in Canada, walked with me not just in the peace table, but when I was trying to recover the bodies of the families of the disappeared. Ireland played, and Eamon in particular, with the victims, a huge role. And you know, everywhere I go, it's amazing. You turn up everywhere, as I say, for such a small country.
That's true. And you and I met in Myanmar actually the first time.
We did. I still remember a cup of tea in that Yangon. And so I want to say thank you. Because sometimes we Irish aren't great at saying thanks or encouraging others or saying fair play to your elbow. So that's what I want to say is thank you. Because, you know, it's the life of a diplomat isn't an easy one either. And you're there 24/7 in good times, bad times, and crises and emergencies. And you're there also, I hope, to celebrate with us on moments like this when we can reflect that we've come through the other end And now we're here tonight from one side of the world to the other, and being able to say, well, how can I help you? And what I love about Ireland and about Department of Foreign Affairs is about giving back. And that's the best part of us. So thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Monica. Thanks for that. And I'll weigh in there as well and say thank you so much to my colleagues, particularly in the conflict resolution unit, who gave me some preparation material today in case topics turned to areas that I don't have much personal experience in or personal knowledge in, but for that, and also for the amazing work that they do, and all colleagues across the department. And I want to say thank you to you, our viewers, who have tuned in today, for submitting your questions. I've no doubt that you enjoyed it and you're as inspired by Monica and the women of Northern Ireland as I am. I want to just give a shout out and ask you all to please remember that there are 2 more events in this wonderful festival. So we have award-winning author, playwright and screenwriter Emma Donoghue giving a presentation tomorrow evening at Pacific Standard Time. And on Sunday, we have the academic, journalist and theatre maker Emer O'Toole giving a talk on Irish feminism, a love story. And that's, I think, at 11 a.m. PST on Sunday. And you can find all of those details on the website, bridgetfestivalvancouver.com. I think it's probably in the chat, or AD might put it in there. Please also fill out the evaluation survey, which you'll get at the end of this event. And thanks so much to the festival director, Maura de Freitas. Thank you to my tech today, Aideen Cleary. Thank you to the ambassador, and thank you to the whole of the St. Bridget's Festival committee who made this all possible. And to play us out today, I'm going to leave you with a short video from the Department of Foreign Affairs, from the Conflict Resolution Unit. They put it together. So the video was created to mark the 20th anniversary of the unanimous adoption of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, which we spoke about earlier. It highlights the 4 pillars of Ireland's National Action Plan on women, peace and security, and it confirms Ireland's commitment to championing the women, peace and security agenda during our 2-year term on the UN Security Council. And if you're interested in finding out more about Ireland's work on women, peace and security, you can find information on the Department of Foreign Affairs website. And again, Aideen is going to pop a link in the chat box and you can access that now, and it'll bring you to like the Women, Peace and Security portal on the department's webpage. You can read the National Action Plan and lots of other information. So thank you once again. Thank you, Monica. Everybody have a lovely weekend and take care.